In a world of economic uncertainty, it's easy to feel like achieving financial freedom is impossible. In today's show, Ken Race and I are going to answer a number of your questions about how, despite all the unknown ahead, property investors can achieve the endgame of financial independence. You'll hear that although the journey may not be easy, with careful and thoughtful planning, you can put yourself in the best situation possible and you can start achieving your financial goals. Now, I know many of our clients at Metropole have built substantial property portfolios that are giving them the sort of options in their lives they never thought possible. So I hope by the end of today's show, you'll have more clarity and direction for your investments in the current, let's call them interesting times. So let's get started talking about how to plan your financial future.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Today's show is one of our popular question and answer podcasts where we answer your questions. And now this follows on from our last podcast where Ken Race and I just couldn't get through all the questions. So I'm again joined by Ken Race, founder and director of Metropole Wealth Advisory, who's widely regarded as Australia's leading property and structuring tax expert. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Michael.
Now, Ken, as we know, we get lots of questions left on the Property Update website, emailed in to us. And in this series of now what's become two podcasts, was only going to be one, but we just went on a bit long last time. I've selected a group of questions that relate to the end game, building a property portfolio that's going to give you choices in life. Now, for the listeners, if you didn't catch our last podcast, that doesn't matter. You can listen to this one first, but you really should listen to our last podcast. Just choose whichever podcast app you're listening to this and look for the last episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, where we answered the following questions. One of the questions was, with so much uncertainty between now and when I plan to retire, how do I formulate a strategic plan? And Ken and I answered that question, as well as the question of how many properties do you really need to retire to achieve a particular passive income. And I think it was $150,000 that the listener asked about. And then we also answered the question, I don't want to wait 20 or 30 years to live off my property portfolio. Is there any advice you can give me to speed this up? So again, if you haven't listened to that, please go back. But today we've got some more questions. So Ken, the first question was left by Margaret, and she says, at what stage do I revert to principal and interest payments on my mortgages to start to retire debt? Now, Ken, I guess the assumption is that there are a number of stages in your property investment journey. I guess the first one is to learn and to educate. And the next one then is to build an asset base. And to do that, you need to leverage and gear. It's just too hard to save your way to wealth. And then eventually you start transitioning to the next stage, don't you, Ken?
That's right. And I think we also need to make the distinction between investment loans, which are tax deductible, versus non-deductible debt on your home.
Makes good sense.
As you were saying, Michael, those first stages, the first two, maybe getting into the third quarter of your life, it's building up assets. So you've got to do that as fast and as safe as possible. So we normally see some clients do interest-only loans. One of the other reasons is, particularly in this current economic climate when interest rates have gone through the roof relative to what they were a couple of years ago, it's hard to maintain those cash flows. So people revert to interest only. So I think once you're nearing retirement, you've got your asset base set. I think that's when you would start looking at repaying debt. Firstly, on your home, making sure that your home loan principal is paid down, and then start looking at reducing debt on your home. But I think even in retirement, you've really got to say, where is the best use of that capital? Because to pay down debt is after tax money. So when you're reducing your debt on a mortgage, let's call it, you might be returning 3% rental income. And so for every dollar you put in, you're really only saving the interest at that 3%.
Which is tax deductible if it's against an investment, Ken.
Correct. So some of our clients are actually investing that money in other assets that are generating a higher yield, which then helps pay for the principal as well as generating a little bit of surplus cash. But it's a case-by-case basis. It's all done individually. You've got to tailor it to your specific circumstances. That's why you need a plan to work out what is the best course of action. And that's got to include a couple of safety nets with, some what ifs.
Now, I know a lot of people think they should enter retirement or their golden years without any debt, and that's not necessarily the case, as you say. Ken, I remember my late mother always used to say, when will you ever own anything? Because she knew I had debt. And currently my bank manager still doesn't understand why I've got substantial debt. I've got very substantial assets, so my net asset base is very high. I don't mind passing on assets with associated debt to the next generation, but you've got to be able to service the debt, firstly, as you said. And I guess in retirement, we don't particularly want non-deductible debt. And so Margaret, who left this question, I hope she listened to last week's show where we actually explained what your end game should be of owning a home without any debt against it and owning a bunch of assets, not necessarily just property, but residential real estate and some assets that would be more cash flow positive, which is exactly what you just said. So there's not an exact answer to your question, Margaret. Again, it comes down to having a plan, because if you have a plan, then you're more likely to stick to it rather than get scared by the news that every night comes out worrying us about interest rates or inflation. Ken Arnold asks, I'm getting close to retirement. Should I sell an investment property to pay off some of my home mortgage debt? Hey, this is related, and improve the cash flow on my other investment properties.
Arnold, great question. And as Michael was saying, similar to the previous question from Margaret, I think we've got to realize that with modern medicine, with the way we've been brought up, with our, if you like, we think about health, we're living a lot longer than we ever have been. So I read something not that long ago that says a person who's 60 in good health is likely to live well into their 90s. So you've got to sort of think that unlike the old days, whatever that means, when you retired at 60, a lot of people passed away, unfortunately, at 65. So we still need asset appreciation as much as possible in retirement. And it needs to be a mix of, can I say, income producing assets, growth assets. So it's a case by case basis. I would look at divestment of properties under two scenarios. The first one is you absolutely have to for various reasons. But think of these properties as pots of money, a well of money that you're going to tap into. So the sequence and the timing of selling those properties is very important. So we've got to make the assumption that they're good investment grade properties as opposed to just any property. So like any asset, you should be always revising to make sure that it's performing how you expected and getting out of it what you need. But as a well, you will tap into that from time to time. So the sale of properties could be over a coordinated period. And then you have to ask yourself the question, what will I now do with that large sum of funds? And that's when, again, you need some advice. Where will it be invested? What's the yield? And there's obviously capital gains tax implications when you're selling property. So you need a capital gains tax strategy as well.
Clearly, people really need to take a long-term focus because, as you said, we are living much longer. And so therefore, when planning, you've also got to plan for your plan, not to go to plan. You really should. In the old days, I remember the financial planners used to say you've got to have a pot of money and slowly eat it up. But what if you live longer? And that's what's happening to a lot of people. Or what if there's a health scare? Or what if there's other issues? Or you've got to help your children. How often do parents have to bail out their kids today, Ken? So you really need to build an asset base and keep it there and not eat it away. Because I think a lot of your clients, our clients, actually want to pass it on to the next generation generation as well. So you shouldn't be, is the right expression, eating the golden goose or the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Yeah. And, a story I've been saying for years, the ski mentality, spend the kids' inheritance, but there's a mixture in the population of people who want to do that, of course, and others who want to pass it on. But can I say that's primarily related to the size of the assets you have? So if you've got good advice, if you've bought good assets, my aim when I talk to clients is to have more than enough to satisfy your needs, so there will be something left over.
Now, interestingly, we've got a few more really good questions to answer, but maybe some people don't really understand what you do, because while Metropole's well known for investment advice, property advice, and home buying, for the last many, many years now, we've been working together as business partners in Metropole Wealth Advisory, and it's very closely related, but it's not specifically property related. In fact, it's really much more related to the topics we're talking about now, isn't it?
That's right. So we're more wealth strategists, and it's the word strategy which is important, because that implies a plan, contingencies, exit strategies, and looking at the big picture. And it's that holistic view that we need to actually allow us to, as we say, grow, protect, and pass on those assets.
Ken, I think the other thing you do is not just help them grow, but, and you're probably going to say this anyway, do it safely. Because one of the things that the team of Wealth Advisory do with you is actually minimize risks, foresee risks that other people sometimes don't see. I think that's probably the biggest risk, because people are worried about interest rates and inflation, other risks. The big risk is the stuff you don't see, you're not prepared for.
The things we don't know. And I think we need a plan that encompasses a wide variety of professions. And that's the falling, that the individual professions don't talk to each other. So we become the bridge to meet those gaps, because we speak their language. We understand their profession. So that way we make sure our clients know the right questions and understand the answers they get from the most appropriate people.
Well, I'll leave a link for Metropole Wealth Advisory in the show notes, and why not click on that and have a chat with Ken, because he will help you with structuring. He'll help you with, as we said, risk management. But in particular, people listening to this show and the last show, I think a lot of people are interested in estate planning and just looking after their future. And I'm not sure that there's too early a stage to do that. A lot of people think, oh, Ken, that's 20, 30 years down the track. When is the right time to think about the future?
Today.
Yeah.
Yesterday was better, but today at least. We say in property, compound growth is really where we get create our wealth. And as Einstein said, that's the eighth wonder of the world. But compound growth requires time. You get your biggest improvements in those latter years. So the earlier you can start, the better you will be, because it'll reduce the time. It'll mean that you can grow a bigger asset base and you can do it more safely.
Now, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a couple of people close to us who've experienced some totally unexpected health issues. One had a severe work injury that's incapacitating him for over 6 months. Others have had health issues. So I think risk management is less about how you respond to risk and more about recognizing how many things can go wrong. But you've got to do it before you actually do. And that's why I really like what your team does. Now, one of the comments you made a moment ago was starting as early as you can, and I agree with that. But Darren asked us a question, and he says, I know I've left my run late. I'm now in my 50s. Is it too late to build wealth through property? What would you say to Darren, Ken?
Look, I think the short answer is no, but, and there's always a but, you can't afford to make a mistake, because you don't have time on your side, which can cover up, if you like, any mistakes and give you a chance to undo. So the longer you leave it, mistakes are more costly, and not that we want to make mistakes, but they become, what's the word? Sink the ship type issues. So That's why you need that professional advice. You've got to do it right the first time.
Well, let's talk about some of the risk minimization strategies to minimize the mistakes. And I think one of the first ones you always put in place for your clients is having a financial buffer in place. This is allowing them to cope with any unexpected vacancies. Hey, we're not getting vacancies today, maintenance, but more importantly, rising interest rates. So we actually help our clients not just buy properties, but buy time to see them through the challenges of the cycle, Ken.
That's right. Putting in place a financial buffer is critical. People often ask me, how much should that be? They ask it in relation to the dollars needed. I spin it around and say, how much time are we wanting to create that safety net, that level of comfort? And a simple way to do that is, what would those expenses, costs be that you would have to meet? Then you ask yourself, how many years comfort level? And then that becomes the dollar value.
Good point. Now, another area I know you and your team help clients with is owning properties in the most tax-effective manner and in the correct structures.
That's right. So there's
Ken,
very
I'm
high
sorry
entry.
to interrupt, but what we should say, which we didn't at the beginning, is this is not specific advice. You're an accountant. You've got financial planning qualifications. We run a company that one of them actually is a qualified financial planning company. But this is general information. So even though we're speaking to the people who've written in these questions, it's not advice for them. Sorry, Ken, to interrupt you, but I just realized that we've got to do all the right compliance things. But this is general information. And if you want specific information, hey, you go and speak to Ken. He'll help you.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. We've just got to be very cognizant of meeting legislation. So as Michael was saying, these are general comments, factual comments, but then go and speak to somebody specifically. So structures are very critical because there's very high entry costs when you talk about property. There's very high exit costs. So to get it wrong, costs you many, many tens of thousands of dollars. So you've got to get it right to start off with. And just an interesting example I just had literally a couple of days ago. The client was in a very high-risk area, profession. His lawyer told him to put his family home in a trust. And then his accountant told him, well, you don't get the capital gains tax benefits for a family home if it's in a trust. But he thought the asset protection far outweighed that. What we were able to do for him is restructure with some additional documentation to give him the free capital gains tax, even though the house was in a trust. So it was one profession not knowing the other profession. So that's that bridge, that gap that I was talking about. You've got to consider things like land tax as well. So the different structures will have different implications with land tax. Different structures might influence the financing solutions. So you've got to ask all those questions to then come up with the most appropriate structure. It might not always be a trust, but it is sometimes. And
there are different sorts of trusts too, Ken.
Correct.
So trust is a very broad, encompassing word. I think one of the other factors people have to consider is insurance, income protection insurance and life insurance, not just the simple landlord insurance. But the other thing I'd be suggesting for Darren at this stage in his 50s is also to consider estate planning, something we tend not to want to talk about, but it's important to plan how you're going to look after your family. It's much more than just a will. Everyone says, oh, I got a will. Is that estate planning, Ken?
No. And in fact, only about 30% of people have a will. The other 70% don't. You've really got to look at what are you trying to achieve, and again, build an estate plan that looks at your will, how you're going to pass funds down. If you've got superannuation, that's not part of your will. If you've got trusts, if you're in business, all those things encompass the estate plan. How safe do you want those assets to move to the next generation, which is on a lot of parents' minds at the moment? So that again is, can I use the word, a different type of will than 99% of people use. But if it's important that you move your assets to the next generation safely, then standard wills just don't work. So again, it's horses for courses. Get advice, because estate planning is more than a will, as we've just said. It encompasses those 5 or 6 areas.
The other comment I'd make for Darren is don't try and do it on your own. I know that you've been listening to this podcast clearly because you inquired, and you've probably been reading my blog and some of my books and Ken's blogs. But again, even though you may save a little bit of money getting free advice on the internet, that's probably the most expensive advice you're going to get if it gets you wrong. So I think apart from employing a good property investment strategist who is independent and unbiased, having a wealth strategist like Ken on your side would be very helpful as well. And I think a big mistake would be to try and rush it. Because you're feeling the time is short, people often try to take shortcuts, Ken. They don't work in general, do they?
They absolutely don't. And it's a shortcut in one of 2 ways. It's not speaking to the right people, implementing something too fast, or, that FOMO, fear of missing out, and jumping in. It's much better to just take the foot off the accelerator slightly and get the plan and implement it correctly.
Okay, continuing on the questions about the retirement and the end game. Another question we got is, in retirement, would I be better off owning $5 million property portfolio with $2.5 million worth of debt, or should I just own a $2.5 million portfolio with no debt? I think this is a little bit like the question we asked before. In other words, a bigger asset base with leverage or not?
That's right. And I think it comes down to, what do you need in retirement? What's the level of funds you need? So the property, because of leverage, allows you to have bigger dollar value of assets, and that bigger asset base is what grows. The debt doesn't grow, that stays stable. Yes, your repayments may increase with increasing interest rates, but the principal amount stays the same. So the more assets you have, that's what will grow. So you've got to determine whether your level of retirement income off the properties is what you need. Do you have other levels or other sources of income? Do you own other investments outside of super? Inside of super, do you own other assets other than property? And you've got to put them all together to see, what is that level of income? Is it enough? And if it's not, then you start bridging the gap by maybe divesting and selling into higher yielding assets.
Well, that actually leads partly to the next question, where Leon said, I've got an underperforming property. Is it a good idea to sell it? How do I know I'd be able to do better with my money? And this sort of goes back to the previous question. Should I divest some of my assets, get rid of some of the properties to get rid of debt? In today's market, where the market is flat and A-grade homes, investment-grade properties are still selling well, but secondary properties are not selling as well. Just getting back to the previous question, Ken, maybe it's worth holding on to a property for a while before you divest. And we're not giving superannuation advice, but we've often seen people living off the money in their super for 5-10 years, giving another decade of capital growth before they start selling property. And by that stage, as you said a moment ago, the debt's often much the same, but the value of the property's doubled. So there's a lot more equity there.
That's right. And not so much for this listener with $5 million worth of assets, but we've got a lot of clients with a lower value, and Centrelink comes into it as well. We need to sometimes bring that into it. Even if you don't get a pension, do you get a health card? And then once you're well and truly into retirement stage, depending on your health, et cetera, you've got to start thinking, what is that next property I'm going to live in? Is it going to be a retirement home? Is it going to be a higher care requirements? So that has to be built into what are your future expectations, which basically boils down to, what is your current health and what do you see it evolving over the short term?
Well, back to the last question we're going to cover today, Leon's question, which says, I've got an underperforming property. Is it a good idea to sell it? And how I know I'll do better with my money? Well, I think the first question I'd be looking at, Leon, is why is it underperforming? Is it the time in the cycle? Because let's be blunt, almost every property in Australia has dropped in value over the last year. Melbourne and Sydney started to drop in value at the beginning of 2022, and the other capital cities in the middle of 2022, with interest rates going up a couple more times, maybe only one more time, who knows. The market's still going to drop a bit before we see a reset in the cycle, and the next property cycle will start. So maybe that's why it's underperforming. Or is it location? And we know that 80% of the property's performance, around that, is related to the location. And then it's got to be the right property, one that'll be in continuous strong demand. So first of all, we've got to work out why. Then I'd be looking at, is there anything you can do to improve its performance? If the location is bad, you're not going to be able to change that. If there's a problem with the property, you may want to refurbish it, improve it. There's time in the cycle you've got to wait. But then you've actually got to do a lot of sums and figures, Ken, because there are significant costs, aren't there, before you can even work out, can you do better?
That's right. And you've got to come back to, is it the basic question, is it a good investment grade property? So it's capital growth versus its income. So we might have a good investment grade property that just isn't getting us the rental return needed. And that's when you can add value, as you said, by doing the renovation, cosmetic or a little bit more, depending on the site and your finances. Can you be a little bit more dramatic and do a small development on that site? So a lot of that would depend on your ability to borrow, of course. So you've got to do the sums, because one of the hidden costs that a lot of people forget is, and it keeps coming up, that when you sell an asset, there'll be a capital gain, hopefully. And if there is, you'll get a capital gains tax. And a lot of people have the mistaken belief that if you're in retirement, you don't have to pay capital gains tax. You absolutely do. The only time you don't is if that capital gain is in your super. And then you pay no capital gains tax in retirement.
Or if it's your principal place of residence.
Or, sorry, Michael, you're absolutely right, your home. So as long as you've been living in the home for the whole period, then it would be a zero tax. But if you'd used part of the time where you've moved in and out and rented it, then you'd have to do that proportional. So you've got to do the sums. And as part of that, if there is a capital gains tax, look at strategies to actually minimize the payment of that capital gains tax.
The other comment I'd make to Leon is, if you want to know, can you do better? Would you do better? Well, the answer is maybe not, because you made the mistakes, and we tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. Now, I know you think, I've actually learned from it, but it's interesting to see that most investors can't get it right. But if you get a good team around you and buy the right sort of property as part of a plan, part of a process. Ken, there is actually a thread going through this continuously, isn't there? Have a plan. Know what you're doing. Don't do things emotionally. Then you're likely to perform better. Now, why do I say that? While I can't guarantee it, I can tell you that the results of our clients at Metropole were audited a year or two ago, and it showed, so the clients themselves weren't, but their results were, and it showed that they're 7.3 times more likely to be in the top 1% of investors in Australia than the average investor. The tax department every year brings out statistics of how many property investors are in Australia and how many properties they own. And it's shown that there's about 2.1 million property investors in Australia. And there's only, well, actually 1.9 million of those only own one or two properties, and around 21,000 own 6 or more properties, less than 1% of all property investors in Australia. And Metropole's clients are 7.3 times more likely to be in that top 1% of property investors. So we have frameworks that we've time tested. Ken and I have been involved in the property markets for, we're embarrassed to say, well, no, we're not. We're proud to say 5 decades.
I was going to say half a century.
Yeah,
sounds bad
right.
when you say it
so
like
we
that.
find, that sounds impressive. So, but it's not just us. There's a team of people who now use the strategies that we've fine-tuned over those decades to help our clients. So rather than just even the odds, we'll actually stack the odds in your favor. And it all starts by building a plan rather than saying, this is where you should buy, that's what you should do. So I think that's the common theme that has come through today, Ken. And while there will be some people concerned about what's happening in the market, I think a message at the moment, I'd like to remind them is nothing too good or too bad stays that way forever, because great times plant the seeds for their own destruction. And that happens as we had this unsustainable property boom where properties just became too unaffordable. But similarly, the difficult times plant the seeds for their own turnaround through opportunity and through problem solving. And we see that later this year, interest rates will peak. Later this year, inflation will peak. It probably already has. Now, I don't think there's anyone, and not one economist, arguing with that. All they're disagreeing with is the timing of it. And when the timing of that occurs, consumer confidence, which is particularly low, will pick up and the next cycle will start. Not a boom, but the cycle will move on as it always does. And our recommendation to you is if you're interested in safely growing wealth through property, have a chat with the team at Metropole before everyone else realizes that auction clearance rates are up and property values are up. So we're hoping to have a chat with you. Even if you're not ready to do anything right now, let's have a chat, because let's see what your options are. And one of the things that we do is, I hope you can see from this chat and my chat with Ken last week, and in fact, our regular ones, is we're not just talking about the next property. We're talking about your future. We see it as our responsibility to look after your future. So even if you're only considering the next property, we're going to do more than that for you. Ken, I think most people, when we talk to them, they don't see the plan as exciting or as sexy. Hey, I just get me a property or just get me a will or a trust. But we take a responsibility to look further ahead than that.
That's right, because it's not just the end product. It's, okay, if you need a trust, why do you need it? Is it going to be used correctly? How are you going to implement it? So it's, even when you're on a health plan, I want to lose 10 kilos. You have a plan. This is what I'm going to have to do. This is the food intake. This is the exercise. What type of exercise? So it's no different to wealth. And a lot of people, I think, unfortunately think it's a dart into a dartboard. Anybody can buy a property, which they can. The difference is, have I bought the property that will actually meet my objectives?
I think that's well said, Ken. So, Ken, thank you again for your time. Now, we do this regularly once a month, but this month we've done 2 shows in a row. So once again, if you didn't listen to part 1 of this, go back to whichever podcast app you're listening to, have a look at that show. And I look forward to catching up with you again real soon, Ken.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to ask you a question. Whose investment are you? The fact is, most people work for someone or an organisation. From the perspective of the employer, their employees represent an investment, an asset. From the perspective of an employee, their employer is a means to an end. And that end, for most unfortunately, is just that payday, the paycheck. However, a select few, they're in it for more than the paycheck. They go the extra mile. They do more than their job description. They pursue responsibilities that go beyond their job description. And here's a little known secret to success that only a small number of employees have ever discovered. Going that extra mile is an investment in themselves. When you do more than your job requires, you grow. As you grow, you become more valuable, not just to your employer, but to every competitor in your industry. The more you go beyond just earning a paycheck, the more you learn, the more new people you come in contact with, the more the value of your own stock rises. Going beyond a paycheck and your job description shifts the investment from your employer to you. It's an investment in yourself. And the more you invest in yourself, the more opportunities you create. And that's one of the hallmarks of self-made millionaires. If you want to become successful in life, you must invest in yourself. You've heard the late Jim Rohn say it so often, work harder on yourself than you do on your job. You must take the responsibility that pushes you outside your comfort zone. This discomfort, it means you're growing. So when you go above and beyond your job description, you're no longer an investment, of your employer, you become your own investment. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?